Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 117 called The Slow Death of the Merovingians. In the last episode we heard how the Frankish king Clovis created a large kingdom in what is today modern France and some of Germany. In France, Clovis is often celebrated as the first French king, but Clovis's Merovingian dynasty was in fact destined to fade and die. In its place, there arose a new dynasty that would become more famous, the Carolingian. But before we say goodbye to the Merovingians, I want in today's podcast to ask the question, why did they die out, and why was it such a slow death? A short answer is that the Carolingians deposed them, but we shouldn't forget that for a very long time the Carolingians were the servants of the Merovingians in their capacity as the so-called mayors of the palace. We can't ignore that the Merovingians ruled for an astonishingly long time, nominally at least, indeed for 240 years after Clovis's death, until the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed in 751. So, what was the truth behind the strange relationship between the Merovingians and Carolingians? Let's start by picking up from the last episode with the reigns of Clovis's sons after his death in 511. And we're lucky enough to have an excellent record of these years in the writings of Gregory of Tours. As I mentioned in the last episode, Gregory, who lived from 538 to 594, and so was writing about 60 years after Clovis's death, had a grudging respect for Clovis, although the person he most admired was his wife Clotilde, who he thought was responsible for his conversion to Christianity. But most of Gregory's famous History of the Franks is in fact about Clovis's successors, and Gregory leaves us in no doubt he had a low regard for them. This was because they spent their time feuding and fighting each other, and there's no doubt this was mainly because the Merovingian dynasty suffered from one catastrophic political disadvantage. It adhered to the Germanic tradition of partible royal inheritance, which means dividing the kingdom among the king's sons rather than primogeniture where the eldest son would receive everything. This meant that Clovis's kingdom was divided between his four sons, Clodomir, Childebert and Lothar, all born to his wife Clotilde, and a fourth, the eldest, Theodoric, probably born to an unknown queen or concubine before he married Clotilde. The problem was that the four sons spent their time in interminable quarrels, only sometimes broken up by their mother Clotilde. Nevertheless, an important point to make is that the Frankish realm continued to expand, especially in the southeast. Clovis's sons combined to subdue Burgundy, which henceforth became part of the Frankish Empire. And an often ignored part of Merovingian history is their invasion of Italy at the time of the Roman Emperor Justinian's wars against the Ostrogoths. The Merovingians were keen to exploit the opportunities offered by the long war between the Romans and Ostrogoths, and in episodes 84 and 85 we heard how the Franks poured into northern Italy in 538. The Ostrogothic king Witigis wanted help from the Franks against the Romans and gifted them Provence and Marseille, which were significant additions to the Frankish kingdom, taking it to the shores of the Mediterranean for the first time. There's no doubt the Franks were unscrupulous as they betrayed their purported allies, the Goths. The Roman chronicler Procopius is scathing about them. In his eyes, they were double-dealing and only intent on making a land grab in northern Italy. They failed because their army first succumbed to dysentery in the hot Italian summer, then to a spectacular defeat inflicted on them by the Roman general Narses at the Battle of the Volturno River in 554, in which the Roman chronicler Agathias says only 5 Franks survived out of an army of 30,000. After 568, the Lombards invaded Italy and pushed the Franks out. They wouldn't return until Charlemagne's conquests. The Merovingian kings could probably have done better in Italy had they not been so preoccupied with their internal family conflicts, as vividly recounted by Gregory of Tours. Lothar ended up murdering the children of Clovis so that his own 3 sons inherited the kingdom. They too ended up fighting and assassinating each other. Particularly brutal was a civil war fought between Lothar's sons Chilperic and Sigebert. This was egged on by their respective wives, who gained a celebrity status in the writings of the Chronicle of Fredegar, who continued the story of the Franks after Gregory's history ended in 591. The 2 wives were Brunhilda and Fredegund. Brunhilda was a Visigothic princess who'd married the Merovingian king Sigebert. Fredegund was a slave girl who had, according to Brunhilda, used her charms to enslave Sigebert's brother Chilperic to her wishes and then murdered his wife, who was Brunhilda's sister, Galswintha, another Visigothic princess. The tale is worthy of a Netflix drama, perhaps to be called The Merovingians, since the princess and slave girl would stop at nothing, including murder, to get at each other. First, the slave girl, Fredegund, assassinated Brunhilda's husband, Sigebert, when he defeated her own husband's army. Over the next 40 years, the 2 women conspired against each other, with Brunhilda acting as regent for her sons, and Fredegund acting as regent for her son when her husband Chilperic died in 584. I won't go into the details of the complex web of plots and assassinations that form a large part of Gregory of Tours' history and that of his chronicling successor Fredegar, but suffice to say it wasn't until Fredegund's son Clotar II defeated Brunhilda's army in 613 that peace returned to the land of the Franks. His mother, Fredegund, the slave girl, had died in 597, and in 613 he exacted his revenge on the Visigothic Brunhilda by tying her to 4 horses, who tore her from limb to limb. Our chroniclers delight in telling us about the story of the princess and the slave girl, but I suggest the real action was in fact taking place elsewhere, somewhere a lot more difficult for a Netflix drama to make exciting. And this was a profound change taking place within Frankish society, which would ultimately result in the dethronement of the Merovingians and their replacement by the Carolingians. And this was the rise of the aristocracy. One of the first manifestations of this came in 614 when Clotar II issued the Edict of Paris. Some historians see it as the Frankish equivalent of the English Magna Carta of 1215. Just to remind you, Magna Carta in England was an agreement between King John and a group of English barons which limited the king's power and strengthened that of the barons. I think the same happened, although perhaps to a lesser extent, with the Edict of Paris almost 600 years earlier. For example, in Article 12 of the edict, the Merovingian king accepted local aristocrats should appoint judges rather than himself. This meant the Frankish aristocracy effectively controlled the legal system. So why were the Merovingians compelled to make concessions like this? I think the real problem was that they had no centralised government and administration. And this showed itself most clearly in 2 areas, the army and taxation. First, the Merovingians only maintained a small central army. When they wanted to launch a large campaign, such as those in Italy, which I just described, they relied on the long-held Frankish tradition that all able-bodied men must report for military service whenever the king required them. Why couldn't they maintain a central army? They couldn't pay for it, and this was because their tax system was a shambles. Yes, they'd inherited the old Roman tax system, but it was a shadow of its former self. Unfortunately, we have little information about it, but it seems very few people paid the poll tax, which had been the mainstay of Diocletian's fiscal system, introduced back in the 3rd century AD, which we covered a long time ago in episode 21. This was really because there was no one to collect the tax. Diocletian's vast bureaucracy, which used to comb the empire for taxes, had disappeared centuries ago, and the Gallo-Romans had nobody who could go out to assess the tax people owed and make them pay. However, the Roman tax system wasn't completely dead. There was still some tax raised from customs duties, since the Merovingians made sure they collected taxes from people using the old Roman bridges and also the old Roman port installations. For example, the Franks were excited when the Ostrogoths ceded the southern Mediterranean port of Marseille to them, because it was still a large trading centre which generated a lot of tax. Unfortunately, we have almost no information about how much tax the Merovingians raised from customs duties, but most historians think the vast majority of their income came from land ownership. Clovis was, in effect, the largest Frankish landowner. He owned more land than anyone else, and as king, he added to his domains when he made conquests. But since he didn't have a large army or a centralised administration, he still relied on the goodwill of the leading magnates to rule. And this was the Merovingians' greatest weakness, which would ultimately lead to their downfall. A good example of their flawed government lay with the so-called Field of March. This was a long-established event required before major military expeditions, when the king would address his subjects and explain the objectives of the campaign he was proposing and listen to their feedback. I think it might have been a little like the town hall meetings which corporations use today as a vehicle for management and employees to exchange views and hopefully to bond together in pursuit of a common objective. But unlike most modern town hall meetings where company management are fairly certain their staff won't be too critical in case they lose their jobs, 1500 years ago in the kingdom of the Franks, things were, perhaps surprisingly, more egalitarian. It was a sacrosanct privilege dating back to the earliest traditions of the Germanic tribes that any Frankish man could voice his opinion freely. Because the king could legitimately be criticised by his own people in this way, he would always take great care to emphasise the plunder and other rewards his people would receive from the campaigns. In other words, he needed to bribe his people to secure their loyalty. And the problem for the Merovingians was that this bribery didn't stop with the gatherings made before military campaigns. Unless the king was exceptionally fierce and successful in war, as Clovis had been, weaker Merovingians offered a continuous stream of privileges, such as exemptions from tax and military service, as well as land and monetary rewards to keep their supporters sweet. And it wasn't just the aristocracy who needed to be bribed. Ever since Clovis converted to Catholicism, the church demanded ever greater endowments and privileges to maintain its support for the Merovingians. The end result was that in the century after Clovis's death, the Merovingian wealth and power drained away as they gifted most of it to the aristocracy. It was a centrifugal force which diminished royal authority and increased aristocratic power. And this was the real reason the Merovingians gradually faded away, and also why it took so long for them to disappear. For it's important to remember that the aristocrats who were becoming more and more powerful also depended on the generosity of the Merovingians, so it wasn't necessarily in their interest to overthrow them, or not yet. By 614, when the Edict of Paris was enacted, it was clear the Merovingians were losing ground, and what consigned them to eventual oblivion was their inability to do anything about it. For over a century, from 639 to 751, the last Merovingian kings were called the rois fainéants, or do-nothing kings, a term first used by Einhard, the famous Frankish chronicler of Charlemagne. Einhard was not the only one who despised them. Almost all historians have condemned them for failing to stop the gradual erosion of their power. And worse than that, they were unable to inspire anything but contempt from their people. The eminent French historian Ferdinand Lot wrote 100 years ago, quote, "Being a suspicious, cruel, capricious and selfish despot, the Merovingian monarch could not be loved by his people," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "The end of Merovingian government was the monarch's personal satisfaction. The kingdom he'd acquired was for him only a soil for exploitation," end quote. So no one liked the Merovingians, not even their most trusted servants, and these were the Carolingians. So let's look at the origins of the Carolingians. Back in 613, when I described the slave girl's son Clotaire II's triumph over his mother's sworn enemy, Brunhilde, among those who had propelled Clotaire to victory were two aristocrats, Arnulf and Pippin. Arnulf exemplified the new type of Frank. Born into a noble family that possessed vast domains, he had the most privileged upbringing imaginable in his age. He was even taught to read and write, which was incredibly rare in his day, and something Gregory of Tours would have been delighted about. Gregory died in 594 when Arnulf would have been a teenager. As a young man, he moved to the royal court, where he could display not just his military skills, but his ability as a gifted administrator when he became manager of the royal domains. Highly intelligent, he was drawn to the growing monastic world and considered becoming a monk. His parents didn't like this and presented him with a young woman of illustrious birth. They married and had many children. At court he met another nobleman, Pippin, and in due course one of his sons married one of Pippin's daughters. A marriage bond had been forged between the Arnulfings and Pippinids that would form a firm foundation for the future. And it was Pippin who was the first of the Carolingians. Historians sometimes call him Pippin the First in view of his many successors, also called Pippin, although at the time he was called Pippin of Landen, which was the location in modern-day Belgium of most of his great estates. He married Ita, a wealthy young heiress with whom he had many children. At court, Arnulf and Pippin worked together to back Clotaire II against Brunhilde. Clotaire rewarded them lavishly. Arnulf, whose interest lay with religion, was made Bishop of Metz. He would later retire from public life and become a monk, famed for his piety, and dying as he cared for a community of lepers. Meanwhile, the more materialistic Pippin was made mayor of the palace of Austrasia. I need to pause here and explain not only what mayor of the palace meant, but also what Austrasia was. First, let me explain Austrasia. Clovis had, as I mentioned, divided his kingdom between his 4 sons, and so there were 4 regions, and they were called Austrasia, Neustria, Aquitaine, and Burgundy. Austrasia and Neustria sound like something out of Star Wars, but in fact, they're derived from the original Frankish names. Austrasia referred to the eastern lands, i.e. the original territory of the Franks in the region around the Rhine, while Neustria referred to the new western lands, so the region from Paris to Brittany. Brittany was never actually conquered by the Merovingians, where Frankish settlers joined the Gallo-Roman population. Mayor of the Palace is also a term that needs explaining. It originally referred to the person who oversaw the royal estates, and an equivalent position among the Byzantines would have been chamberlain or chief minister, and among the Arabs, grand vizier. But while first ministers in those regimes mostly carried out the wishes of their masters, with the Merovingians, the mayors of the palace became the leaders of the aristocracy. The Pippinids and Arnulfings were the preeminent aristocratic families, and many other noble families backed them, such as the Agilolfings, the Ganduins, and the Adelgisils. This meant Pippin became the de facto ruler of the Austrasian kingdom, and the Merovingian king Clovis was just his puppet. Clovis seems to have been happy with this, but his son Dagobert was made of sterner stuff. He tried to dilute Pippin's authority by moving him to Neustria, while he managed Austrasia himself. This worked for a while, but after Dagobert's death in 639, Pippin's son Grimoald attempted to oust the Merovingians completely when he seized the position of mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, and then placed his own son on the official throne of Austrasia when the Merovingian king Sigebert III died. However, this audacious move proved too bold. The Neustrian Merovingian king Clovis II intervened, and in 656 he tricked Grimoald and his son into a meeting, at which he killed them both. But that was not the end of the Pippinid family. Far from it. It was just the beginning. Clovis II died in 657, and Grimoald's nephew, Pippin II, rebuilt his power base in Austrasia, where he was widely supported by the Frankish nobility. He raised an army from his own domains and attacked the Neustrian mayor of the palace, who ruled in the name of the Merovingian king of Neustria, Theodoric III. He defeated them at the Battle of Tertry in 687. Tertry proved decisive in transferring power into the hands of Pippin II, who didn't repeat Grimoald's mistake of dethroning the Merovingians. Instead, he allowed the Merovingian king Theodoric III to rule, but in name only, while he was mayor of the palace in Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy, i.e. most of the kingdom of the Franks. Pippin II's son would succeed him, Charles, or as he's sometimes called, Karl, who would later become better known as Charles Martel or Charles the Hammer. He was the first of a series of strong Carolingian rulers who would ultimately depose the puppet Merovingians. And a strong ruler was needed now more than ever before, for in 692 the might of the Umayyad dynasty was restored after the disastrous Muslim civil war called the Second Fitna. Islam was back on the offensive. Its armies were on the march in all directions, north against Byzantium, east towards India and China, and in the west, once North Africa was secured, it was the turn of Spain. In 711, as we heard in episode 115, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed when its army was defeated by an invading Berber force from North Africa at the Battle of Guadalete. The kingdom of the Franks was next. In 732, an Islamic army advanced into Aquitaine and ravaged Gascony. The battle for Europe was about to be fought. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll continue with the story of the Great Battle of Poitiers, where the Franks fought the Arabs, in 2 weeks' time on the 30th of August. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter, where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.